Hi, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Just want a show of hands. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. This is the volume I'm going to use. Okay, awesome. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first session of the New England Grazing Conference. I am super excited to help kick off the morning here. Unfortunately, there is a deviation from the program. Dr. Rachel White will not be joining us this morning. She unfortunately had an emergency. So I'm going to cover not her section, but an extended version of my own presentation. We're going to include a couple more things than what was listed in the agenda, and hopefully you'll find them useful. So my name is Amy Barkley. I'm a livestock specialist with the Cornell University Cooperative Extension, Southwest New York, Dairy Livestock and Field Crops program. I've come from the land of snow. South of Buffalo, we've gotten 125 inches of snow so far this year and woke up to temps like many of you in the negative 10s. So really enjoying our Arctic tundra, hoping for the grazing season already, but it'll come here before we know it. This program today is going to be about our research project that we conducted here in 2025. So the background, well, I should say, this was funded in part through NEFA, through the Northeast Risk Management Extension and Education Grant, and the work here is covered by this project. So we really thank them for the funding to help make this whole project possible. As I go through this presentation, feel free to raise your hand and ask questions instead of waiting till the end, just so that I make sure I answer the pertinent ones as we go through, and we'll get into it. So this project was ideated because in Southwest New York, like a lot of the Northeast, we have challenges with internal parasites in our sheep and goats, and camelids if you're into camelids. What we know is that the internal parasite pressure is continuing to increase, and that is because of animals coming into the herd from other areas of the country where we have these worm problems. Historically, we've seen issues from worms like brown stomach worm, but now we're really starting to see a lot of significant impacts from Haemonchus contortus, which is the barber pole worm. How many of you are familiar with Haemonchus contortus? Hey, I'm so sorry. Hopefully it's not that big of a negative experience. What we noticed in Southwest New York is that regardless of flock size, regardless of management style, folks are coming in contact with these two parasites and they're just wreaking havoc in the flock. So we wanted to go ahead and take the initiative to help 10 producers improve their outcomes in parasite management, as well as educate folks within our region about these parasites and how they can help control them. So as I said, these are the two parasites that we're focusing on. For those of you who don't know the barber pole worm, it is this lovely beast over here. This is the female. The female is rung like a barber pole. That is her intestinal tract and her reproductive tract intertwining. And she does look like that. The brown stomach worm is a little bit different. It is this big boy over here. And the differentiator there is it's got piercing mouth parts that will pierce the abomasum, its piercing mouth parts will pierce the glands within the abomasum, whereas the barber pole worm is a blood-feeding parasite. For those who are not familiar with the life cycle of this bad boy, it is not really a problem in the winter months. We start to see the increase in issues in the spring. So April, May, when the days get a little longer, animals are going out onto pasture. And what we find is that within 1 to 6 days, the parasite eggs released from the inside of the animal will hatch in the fecal pads or the fecal piles in the pasture. Depends on temperature and humidity. Sometimes it can be as little as 2 to 3 days. Sometimes it could be upwards to a week. So once that hatches, it is free living. It's going to go ahead and eat bacteria in the manure pad. It's going to molt. It's going to grow. And then it becomes a stage 2 larva where it is free living, again, keeps eating bacteria, but it doesn't shed that cuticle, keeping it safe and sound within the system. Now, once it does its third shedding and becomes an L3, which is the infective version, it's a little more delicate. It needs the moisture and the humidity of the lower part of the pasture in order to survive. And it doesn't really go out of its way to get consumed. It will only move about 2 inches up into the grass blade in order to be picked up by our grazing species. Now, once it's consumed, then it's going to cause havoc within the abomasum. So it's going to develop into an adult, mate, lay eggs. Has anybody seen this picture before? Yeah, this is a pretty common one. So this is what these parasite infective larvae look like in a water droplet in the leaf of a grass blade. So there's quite a few of them. And once, like I said, once they're consumed, they're infective. So it's 5 to 14 days to get from that egg within the animal into an infective larva. And that larva is going to move up and down through the grass blade. Its life is about 45 to 60 days. It's going to depend on temperature, humidity, UV radiation, that sort of thing. So hot or drier, it dies off. Cooler, wetter, it survives. Yeah.
So is it a risk in that form?
Yes, this is the risk.
And that only stays at 2 inches? Or is
Approximately 2 inches. Yeah, it doesn't really have the energy to go much higher. And it's going to follow the water droplets up and down. So this is why we recommend to graze no lower than about 4 inches in your pastures to avoid picking this up. Yeah, good question. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the brown stomach worm first, and then we'll talk about Haemonchus next, just to give you a little bit more background. Historically, like I said, this was the issue in cool climates. It's still an issue in beef production primarily, but in small ruminants, this has now been overtaken by Haemonchus. Brown stomach worm on its own is not great. So what these worms do is they destroy the gastric glands that release the acid into the stomach to aid in digestion. And so these animals have decreased appetite because their stomach is all messed up. They fail to absorb nutrients because they can't digest them properly. They've got diarrhea, again, because poor nutrient digestion, and their hair coat's rough because they're not able to take that energy and nutrition and put it into how they look, let alone gain, let alone developing offspring. It impacts the bottom. So this is barber pole worm. This is the most economically damaging parasite. Also lives in the abomasum, but it is blood sucking. So this is the mouthpiece of that parasite, just for close up. It is the heavier egg producer of the two, and it'll produce between 5 and 10,000 eggs per worm per day. The tricky bit about this worm is that in mass, so the number of parasites in the animal grows exponentially. Once you hit a high enough threshold, a lamb can lose up to 1/5 of its blood volume per day. So you can have a lamb, looks perfectly fine, good weight gain, good body condition, good hair coat, and then it's dead. And you're like, what's going on? You check the eyelid, it's essentially got no blood in its body. So that's the type of thing we're worried about here. I'll tell a little story while I'm here. So I was called out to visit suspect mortality in a sheep flock, about 200 ewes or so with their lambs. Their lambs were probably about 2 months old at the time, just weaning. So a stressful period in the lamb's life. 10% of the lamb crop had already died. So by the time I got out into the pasture, there were dead lambs everywhere. It was like a battlefield. And that producer thankfully caught it early enough where he didn't lose too many of his lambs. But I also know producers that have lost up to 25% of their lamb crop just simply because of this parasite. So it is a huge economic impact for our region's producers. Now, susceptibility to the parasite is highly dependent on age, nutrition, stage of production, and stress. So there's a lot of things that we can do outside of giving anthelmintics that are going to help manage these parasites. This is a chart that I got out of a paper. I like to walk, and I know I have to stay near the microphone. So I'm gonna, let's see if I can pull up let's see if I can get my pointer out here. Okay. All right, so when we look at lambs are going to be the most susceptible group of everybody, and that's because their immune system hasn't really been fully developed. And what we see within these groups, regardless of age, but especially in lambs, is that those that are underfed protein, those that are underfed minerals, are going to have a worse immune response to anything in general, and especially worms. So those that are most susceptible are going to be those animals under 5 months of age that do not have a proper nutritional profile. As those lambs age to a year, that genetic susceptibility decreases. And then as they get to 2 years, they're mature animals, they have a mature immune system, they're able to fight this better. When we're looking at our ewes and which are most susceptible, those that are most susceptible are going to be under stress. And that stress can look like lactation, And if they have more lambs or more kids on them, that's also going to increase the amount of stress that their immune system is receiving. So you can see that a dry, well-fed animal has the best immune response relative to the other animals in a similar group. So how do we look at an animal and say that animal is a candidate for deworming? Because as many of us know, nowadays, we don't want to deworm the whole flock or the whole herd on a regular basis. That was information that we used to share with an extension 10, 20 years ago, but unfortunately, that's led to a high level of resistance within our anthelmintic classes. We only have 3 classes, and we've got to make sure we're not developing resistance, because once those classes are gone, they're gone. There's no new ones in the pipeline that are being developed, just variants of drugs within the same class. So how do we recognize which individual animals to strategically deworm so that we're not promoting resistance? One of the ways is a 5-point check. Yeah.
Sorry, can I just back up one?
Sure.
You referred to that immunity as genetic.
Sorry, that was a yes.
But the genetic immunity is coming out over the age?
So yes, it will. So I should clarify that. So the question was, I said genetic immunity before when I was referring to age and stage of production immunity. Genetic immunity does play into this. So we do know that different breeds are more genetically susceptible to worms than other breeds. The genetic potential of immunity within an individual animal is going to improve as that animal ages.
So you would say if you're searching for that genetic characteristic,
Mm-hmm.
you need to wait longer to observe that?
Not necessarily. So you don't need, and I'm repeating the questions for the folks online, you don't necessarily need to wait for the genetic susceptibility to show up. You can test these animals for worms as early as you want to. As they age, you're going to see a different response. I can't say if it's going to be less or more. We're going to talk about a case study here that looks at animals, and you can see the variation in the worm loads in animals that are doing perfectly well. So some animals are going to have a high amount of worms. Some animals are going to have a low amount of worms, and depending on their individual genetics are going to tolerate that infection differently. So we do select animals that have the ability to carry worms, but are not showing symptoms in order to promote resistance within the herd or flock.
So genetic selection should be throughout the whole life.
Yes, genetic selection should be throughout the whole herd or flock, throughout the whole life cycle. Yep, good question. Yes.
Isn't there a difference between resilience and resistance?
Correct. Yeah, so there's genetic resistance where the animals are genetically predisposed to tolerate a higher worm burden. Then there's resilience, which is the general term for resisting an infection. And so I would say that this part, nutrition, is a way to improve resilience of infection. Yeah, good distinction. All right. So jumping back into the 5-point checks, there are 5 things that we check on the animal. The most important, because barber poleworm is our species of greatest interest, we're going to check for the anemia score. This is done with a FAMACHA card, and you're going to check the lower eyelid membrane for signs of anemia. This is, if they're anemic, you deworm them. But if they're not showing anemia, some other ways that we can see animals that are candidates are if they have developed bottle jaw. So this is a condition where the blood is not recycling lymph properly, and so it accumulates between the jaw bones under the jaw. It is separate from milk goiter, which is a little lower down in the neck of the animal in younger animals. But if the animal's off milk, they should not have a milk goiter. This is going to be that bottle jaw symptom. We're also checking body condition score. So how do those animals feel under the palm of your hand? Are they skinny? Are they fat? Are they normal? And you can't just look at the animals. You have to get your hands on them, especially wool breeds, especially long-haired breeds of goats like Angoras, because you just can't tell by looking at them. The other thing that we look for is DAG score, and that is essentially how much poop is adhering to the back end of the animal. This indicates a level of diarrhea, and if there is wetness on the back of the animal, that could indicate an infestation of worms like the brown stomach worm, which causes diarrhea, or it could just be really good forage. In our study, we saw some animals with a lot of diarrhea on the back end, and that was because they were eating really high quality forage, especially later in the season. The other part of the 5-point check here is the nose. We check that because there are nasal bots and other things that impact how well that animal is breathing. And there are indicators there, obviously, if there's discharge, if there's pus, if there's swelling, redness, that may indicate an additional infection in addition to what we're seeing in the animal in terms of parasite loads. This is just a little close-up of a FAMACHA evaluation. Who's taken a FAMACHA course? About half of you. That's pretty good. If you have not taken a FAMACHA course, I highly recommend it. There are educators throughout the Northeast that will help employ these education things. So Rachel Moody, she's capital area, she does it. I do it out in Western New York. She's Eastern New York. Rachel White up in Maine does it. And there's probably 50 or 60 other folks that do it. So I'll give you a resource at the end to show you where to find those people so you can reach out and get FAMACHA trained if you are not already. All right, so the project piece. We recently were able to fill some of our staff at Cornell University, and we have a pro-livestock, sheep-focused educator now at the university level, which is super duper exciting. And she works with all of us regional educators to help bring this kind of research to the farm. So that's Jess there, and there's me. We're suited up in bio gear at this goat farm, which is one of our project farms. So as I stated earlier, our project goals were to work with 10 regional sheep and goat producers with the goal of 70% of those farms that we worked with through one-on-one consultations, adopting management changes to decrease worm burdens and resistance. This was culling genetically susceptible animals, as you had said. This was adjusting pasture management, rotational grazing to limit the worm loads in the animals. This was adopting effective dewormers because some folks were using dewormers that were not effective anymore because they developed genetic resistance. And then implementing IPM-based procedures in order to give the dewormer as to not promote additional resistance. We expected that these farmers would improve their basic parasite control measures and see the reflection in increased productivity and health in these animals while building resilience in the sheep and goat industry in Southwest New York. Like many parts of the region, we are converting a lot of our dairies into alternative production, and sheep and goats is just one of those. We want to also reduce our reliance on the limited number of veterinarians in the area. Like everybody else, we are in a veterinarian shortage, especially a large animal veterinarian shortage. So by giving these producers tools that they can use on their own farm, we can reduce the reliance on having a veterinarian to come in and check these animals if the producer knows how to do it themselves. We also felt that going through this, that we would encounter lower treatment costs, again, because you're treating individual animals that are susceptible rather than the whole flock or herd, and reducing losses from parasite-related illness, which we did see in the study. So essentially what we did is we went out to the farms in May or June of last year. We evaluated all animals over 9 months of age just because we had to have an age cutoff. There were animals lambing, there were animals kidding, there were animals that were drying off. So there were some variations in what stage of production those animals were in. So we chose 9 months old and up. We evaluated them in May or June. We looked at the 5-point check. We looked at FAMACHA scores. And then we took fecal samples from individual animals to do fecal egg counts. And then we came back in 2 weeks to do a fecal egg count reduction test. So essentially those animals that showed signs of severe anemia or had a really poor 5-point check, so they had dags, they had rough hair coats, they were really skinny, and there wasn't a reason. So like if they weren't nursing, we'd said, okay, well, maybe this is a parasite infection. And based on the discretion of the farmer, we then employed the use of dewormers. So those are in the animals that were dewormed, were rechecked in 2 weeks to determine the efficacy of the dewormer. So fecal egg count reduction testing. I just talked about this a little bit. Farmers who were interested were also taught on how to do fecal egg count evaluations at home. So again, giving them the tools they could use to do these checks themselves to reduce reliance on outside services. And why we did this is with fecal egg counts, what we can understand is which animals are carrying the majority of the worms and which animals are carrying those worms well, which ones are tolerating those the best. We can also see if the dewormer was effective and then use these to make management decisions on who to call, who to keep, and how to improve pasture management to reduce overall worm loads within the flock or herd. So the steps for this, we essentially reached into the anus of each animal and grabbed the pellets directly from the anus. So this allowed us to very specifically target individual animals. And if you're going to do this at home, I highly recommend this rather than picking up feces off the ground, because you don't know who produced that pile unless you see it happen, in which case you get a pass. You can collect that. Well, again, we dewormed based on the FAMACHA fecal egg count 5-point checks. So if a producer's worm counts, if the egg counts came back very high, and we had some discretion in that. We said, okay, if there's over 1,000 eggs per gram, we're probably going to deworm, or we're going to recommend that you deworm. I have to back up and give the preface that says, just because your fecal egg counts are high does not mean you have to deworm. We don't have very strong evidence that suggests what number of fecal eggs per gram indicates the need to deworm. It's the recommendation to deworm. It's not the need to deworm, because that animal with 15,000 eggs per gram may be tolerating that infection just fine through genetic resistance and resilience. And so we don't need to deworm that animal maybe. So that's where the FAMACHA comes in. So we used the FAMACHA to double check, and we said, okay, if your anemia score was fine, if you had good blood perfusion, you had a good body condition, good hair coat, we're not going to deworm you. So that's what we did here. When we rechecked the feces into, yes.
Thinking about this in terms of a whole flock management system.
Yes.
If you've got an animal that's shedding, whatever, 10,000 eggs per gram, that is a source, right?
Yes.
Whether she's doing fine, she's infesting everybody else.
She is.
So there's an argument there for deworming her.
Yes.
And culling her.
Yes. Yes. So to repeat the question for those on Zoom, the comment was, there's an argument to be made to cull that animal that is tolerating the worm loads just fine, because by culling that animal, you're decreasing the overall worm loads released onto the pasture, thereby decreasing the number of worms available for the sheep to pick up. And that animal is probably not good to keep within your herd or flock. So that is the other argument. So the argument is you could keep it or you could not keep it. That said, 80% of your animals are going to only carry 20% of the worms on your farm. You're always going to have 20% of the animals that are going to carry a higher worm load. So you could get rid of her and then maybe see what the next highest one is, and then make your culling decisions that way.
200 billion, or is it 80% of 200 billion?
It's 80. I understand what you're saying.
That's where I'm going.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah. So if you've got 20 animals in your flock and you've got one super shedder, you get rid of the super shedder. That could be a valid management decision. If you've got one animal that's really high and you're doing really frequent pasture rotations, so maybe once a day, every other day, maybe she gets to stay in your management system. So it's going to highly depend on what your management system is too. Yeah. Yeah.
Can I just follow up on that?
Sure.
My understanding is that animal that the gentleman described as shedding 10,000 eggs per gram, but has a bright FAMACHA score.
Yeah.
A nice deep red score. To
Yeah.
me, that's a resilient animal.
Yes.
Not a resistant animal. The resistant animal would have 100 eggs per gram, or 200 eggs per gram, or 50.
That's fair.
So that's my understanding.
Yeah.
That gets back to the gentleman asking about genetic resistance as well, but
right.
That's the way I have dealt with it for the past 10, 20 years.
Yeah, no, that is accurate. So we don't know if there's genetic resistance or resilience going on in that particular animal, but you're right. Resilience is the ability to withstand an infection better within the same group of animals with the same characteristics, same age, same sex, same genes.
And, it could be as simple as, I don't mean to say simple, but it could be they have the ability to turn their bone marrow on or shift into high gear, produce more red blood cells or whatever. I've seen it.
Sure.
But the decision to get rid of that animal is a tricky one.
It is a tricky one.
Possess traits that you want.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful about reproducing that animal. So
exactly.
Yeah, I was going to make that point, and thanks for the folks in the back who mentioned it. But
yeah.
Resilience and resistance is an everyday occurrence. And
it is.
we probably all have both.
We do.
So,
Yep. Yeah. And that's why it's such an individualized decision. And this is why we worked one-on-one with farmers and why we didn't give overarching recommendations, because every individual's management style is different, and that's okay. So thank you for those points. I appreciate those. Okay. So those critters that we fecal egg count reduction tested, if we saw 75% or greater reduction in eggs per gram on the recheck, that indicated that the dewormer was effective. We saw anything ranging from 0% efficacy all the way up to 100% efficacy, but know that at least 75% reduction indicates that your wormer is still effective. We did, I'll show, well, I'm not going to get ahead of myself. I'll show you some case study things on that. What we did make sure we did, though, is when we did these reduction tests, that we tested one dewormer at a time. Because if you give a combo dewormer, and that might be, you might be in a scenario where you've got to do that, or you prefer to do that. The combo dewormers, you don't know which dewormer is effective out of those two. And you don't know if there's a reaction between the two that are causing them to be effective. So we tested one dewormer at a time to at least tell the farmer, okay, you can use this class, you can't use this class. And then if we got to the point of where we had to combo test the combo dewormer, we could. So we talked a lot about the limitations of using a fecal egg count test already in this conversation, but I'll go over them in point detail here. So depending on the skill of the analyzer, you might not be able to differentiate between worm species. And in this particular study, we did not differentiate between the different types of strongylids. I am not educated enough to pull those differences out. There are 9 different species that we look for in our small ruminants, and they look pretty much the same. And if you go to our Good, the Bad, and the Wormy part 2, you'll start to see why some of these critters look the same. So what we did is we said, okay, if they've got anemia and a high worm load, it's probably Haemonchus. If they've got diarrhea and a high load, it's probably brown stomach worm. But we couldn't differentiate that down to a point exactly. One single test of a fecal egg count reduction test can't tell you the worm status for the whole year. Over time, the worms do different things biologically. This time of year, they're pretty much encysted in the gut wall, and they are hanging out in the pastures, not doing much of anything if they're in a stage where they can survive the winter. Probably not. They're probably not going to survive out there, but the worms in the guts of the animal are encysted. So if there is a shedding of worms, it's going to be low, because those worms are doing everything they can to make themselves as safe as they can so that when spring comes up and nutrition increases, they can reproduce. It's also difficult to draw conclusions from multiple tests taken on different animals at different times of the year. Consistency is the key to making these things work. So if you're going to test animals, test all your animals. Let me back up. If you're testing for genetic resistance or resilience, test all your animals at the same time using the same procedure. That's going to give you answers versus if you test half your herd in June and half your herd in July and then make decisions. You can't compare those two animal groups. Those worms are doing something different within the environment within their host at that time. So just know, depending on what you're looking for, you may have to be more consistent with what you're doing. And we talked about the last point ad nauseum. I'm going to skip that. Okay. So we already talked about this, how we related anemia and egg counts to Barber pole worm. This is actually a bottle jaw case we saw in goats. For those of you who raise goats, any goat people in here? A handful of goat people. Love y'all a long time. Your critter is challenging. The farm on the study was boar goats. And for those of you who don't know boar goats are genetically susceptible to worms if they look at them sideways. So unfortunately, this producer had a very severe case of worm infestation. We'll talk about them in the case study, but we did see a gorgeous bottle jaw animal that we then very quickly treated to get her recovered. All right, so here's the results. So the study demographics, we had the 10 farms in southwestern New York State. 9 of those were sheep farms, 1 was a goat farm. We had mixed use, fiber, show, and meat. There were a lot of 4-H lambs and kids coming out of this study. Most of the flocks or herds averaged only 25 animals. We've got very small pockets of production. Well, I say large pockets of production with very small herds and flocks around Western New York. So this was our demographic. 2 farms had between 75 and 100 animals, and then one had 42, and then one had 8. So just a wide variety of numbers there. This picture is one of our larger farms, believe it or not. So this is Katahdins and some crosses with their lambs on them at the time. So we were sorting them and doing some the analysis that we needed to do for the study. So what were the general trends? We found, unsurprisingly, that worse FOMACHA scores, more anemic FOMACHA scores, correlated directly with worm burdens. Bottle jaw prevalence, like we saw in the previous image, was relatively low. Only a couple of producers mentioned that they had this, and of the producers that had it, they realized it was a problem and immediately went through and dewormed their animals. But they used that as an indicator of whether or not they were at a point where they needed to deworm an animal. So that we don't want them to get to the bottle jaw point before we treat, but it's helpful as an indicator. Yes.
When you talk about worm burden, are you inferring that from the FDC?
Yes. Yep. So the question was, are we inferring worm burden by the fecal egg count? And yes, we were. Most farmers dewormed all their animals on a schedule when we first got to the farm. So they said, okay, we're going to run them through. We're going to deworm everybody 2 weeks before lambing, a week at weaning, and then all of our young stock are going to be dewormed prior to going to their new homes. There wasn't a lot of individualized anemia scores, 5-point checks, and then strategic dewormings. And this trend we did switch by the end of the project, which we're really excited about. We also found that farmers had a higher body condition score in the fall versus the spring. Unsurprisingly, those animals in the spring were under a lot of stress. They were weaning, and if they weren't weaning, they were providing milk for their lambs or kids. And we also found that forage quality this year, while limited due to the drought, was really high. So animals that were getting forage were able to utilize that and increase their body conditions. Rotational grazing was already in place and used by most of our farms prior to the study, but we did make some tweaks to that individually. So we recommend that pastures lay fallow for 45 to 60 days after the sheep have gone through. And we only recommend a retention time between 3 and 7 days on a pasture prior to movement off. This is going to reduce the worm burdens that your sheep come in contact with. We found that diarrhea, DAG scores, correlated with pasture quality rather than worm loads. And we found that poor coats correlated with higher worm loads. Poor hair coats correlated with stressors outside of worm loads. So you look at an animal, she looks really trashy. Well, it turns out she just weaned 3 kids. So that was why. She came back with a worm burden that was very low, like 100 or 200. Yeah.
Recommending 3 to 7 days.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you can dive into that a little bit further, because it seems to me like there's a big difference between 7 days.
Yeah. So the question was, can I elaborate a little bit more on why the pasture recommendation for rotation is a wide range of 3 to 7 days? So part of that comes from your ability to manage that pasture. If you can rotate them more frequently, do so. But if you're working full time and you don't have the capacity to move the pasture, but once every 7 days, that's the best you can do. The other part of that is the biology of the worm. So earlier in this conversation, we talked about those worms having a period of hatching that was between 3 and 7 days where they get into the infective stage. Now, that 3 to 7 day timeline depends on temperature, humidity, the amount of UV radiation. So in the spring and in the fall, we want to rotate them more frequently. In the summer, we can rotate them less frequently. However, this is the opposite of what pastures do. The pastures are going to be more lush, and you can keep them on for longer in the spring and the fall versus the summer. So there's a lot of factors at play. And unfortunately, it's not a one-size-fits-all recommendation. It's going to come down to your individual ability to manage, what the pasture's doing, what the animals need, and then what the worms are doing. So what the weather's doing. Yes. So did that answer your question? Okay, great. All right. So additionally, in terms of genetic resistance, we found that Texels and St. Croix had very low parasite burdens. So in other mixed flocks, we're talking about the sheep, I'm taking the goats out for a minute. In terms of mixed flocks with mixed breeds, they generally had higher fecal egg counts than those that were genetically purely St. Croix or genetically Texel or Texel crosses. 20% of the animals carry 80% of the worms. This is an adage that we've heard ad nauseum, and we found it to be true within our study, with the exception of a challenged herd. And a challenged herd is an animal that's challenged with their nutritional plane. A challenged herd is an animal or a group of animals that are challenged by their management style, by their ability to rotate off pastures in the time frame that we recommend, the amount of stress on their bodies. When we saw this happen, the numbers broke down and we saw higher worm loads overall. So I'm going to get into the case studies from this project that I think you'll find interesting. So I've numbered them rather than named them to keep anonymity. Now, farm 2, we found resistance to sidectin. So that was their preferred dewormer of choice. They applied it to those animals that were that had poor FAMACHA scores, and we found only a 0 to 53% reduction in fecal egg counts, which indicates to us that they need to switch classes. So they switched classes, we retested, and the dewormer was effective. So yay. Farm 4, they had a partial resistance to valbazin. And why I say partial resistance, this is me using a term, because they saw 76% reduction, which means the dewormer is still effective, but by 1 percentage point. So the recommendation to them was keep an eye on your animals. If the dewormer is not working when you recheck them, switch classes, because you're probably going to end up with true hard and fast resistance to this dewormer soon. Farm 7, unfortunately, they had resistance to all 3 classes of dewormers, with 50% of the animals in that flock tested for the project. Some animals even gained worms in between treatments, and we'll talk about that farm in a little bit. Farm 8, they had a resistance to all 3 classes of dewormers again, and all animals gained worm loads with startling speed. So here's the case study 1. So this was a show and meat flock made up of Dorset, Dorset Advantage, and Weathershire ewes and rams, 1 ram, 21 ewes. They used valbazin and sidectin in rotation. They dewormed the ewes prior to going on to pasture, everybody. And they dewormed the show lambs multiple times annually and before the show to save them, because they knew that they were dying of worm loads. They knew their pastures had high numbers of worm loads the way they were managed. They'd had past issues with that, and the pastures were also wet, which tends to promote the livability of these parasites within the pasture. Only 1 animal needed to be dewormed at that time. That was, I believe, a late May test that we did. So they weren't yet on pasture, so they didn't have those high worm burdens. And that's where we saw the reduction. So we said, yeah, we need to keep an eye on this because you're nearing resistance. So here's case study 2. Barn raised doesn't mean you're free from worm challenges. These were Suffolks, purebred Suffolks for show, that were kept in a barn full time with a couple little outings into the back 40 sometimes for a treat. They were dewormed twice annually. Now here's the challenge that came on with these critters. So these are the individual animals here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that had resistance issues that we retested, dewormed with another class, retested, dewormed with another class because we kept finding resistance. In May, their fecal egg counts were, around 1,000, high, definitely deworm territory. But even with the dewormer, you can see how those animals climbed with the number of worms. We saw around 15,000 worm eggs per gram in one individual, which is incredible. Their FAMACHA scores were not great, and no matter what we threw at them, nothing helped. And we kept having conversations with the producer. Are these dewormers kept in the right place? Are they kept out of direct sunlight? Were they allowed to freeze? Did you get them from a reputable source? Are they in date? Yes. So, okay, why else are these worm loads climbing? Well, probably because those critters are being let out into the pasture for a snack every once in a while, and they're bringing the worms back, and then they're just proliferating in the environment. We found that producer had not cleaned out their bedded pack in quite some time. The barn was on the wetter side. So we recommended that they clean out the bedded pack and stop the practice of feeding directly from the floor. Feeding directly from the floor causes coccidia, you know. And it can also result in the animals reconsuming those larvae in the infective stage just simply because of their access to the manure from eating off the floor. We also moved the waters onto blocks because the animals were backing into the waters and depositing feces right into the water, which they were drinking and reinfecting themselves. We also found that this producer was not using minerals at all. So we recommended that they put out a mineral for sheep, made sure that they added a mineral to the ration, and we also had them give injections of E and selenium to supplement the immune system to get it jump started again. So even without grass, these critters became infected, or regular grass, these critters became infected, and they struggled a lot this year. So this just goes to show that there's other management things that we can do to improve our resilience in our system. Animals' body conditions didn't improve. FAMACHA improved by a point, but it went from like 4 to 3. So not a huge improvement, but enough to keep them alive and to get them through this little rough spell. The producer did agree not to breed those animals for the 2026 lamb crop, in part because we didn't think they'd catch, and in part because we didn't think that they'd survive the pregnancy. Okay. So this is case study 3 of genetic resistance. So this is Texels and Texel crosses. This flock was hysterical. They all had names that were given by the flock owner's son. So we had like Big Mac and Yankee and Wings and Donut. It was fantastic. They were just these little plump animals. Well, not little, gosh, they were like 160 pounds, and they would try to like leap over your shoulder because they weren't super well socialized. That was a trip. Anyway, fecal egg count range was one of the highest to start. And this is some of the fecal egg numbers that we were talking about. So we were talking earlier about resilience or resistance and resilience. This shows you which animals are most genetically resilient because they're basically all the same breed. So we've got anywhere from 250 eggs per gram up to 4,900 eggs per gram. But when we look at the FAMACHAs and the body condition scores, they're doing fine. They're doing okay. So the innate genetic resistance plus the resilience is causing those animals to be successful. Yes. Mm. Ooh.
Oh. Yes, you can.
Yeah. So body condition scores at the top here. So for those of you who aren't familiar with body condition score, a higher body condition score is better. We want to see about around a 3-4. FAMACHA is 1 is good, 5 is bad. So it's the opposite of body condition score. So 1s, 2s, and 3s are all we don't need to deworm categories. 3, maybe, but usually not. And then the strongyloid eggs per gram is the counts that we found. So let's.
I guess I wouldn't consider a 3 great.
Well, if they had a high body condition score, no wool break, no dags, had just weaned.
FAMACHA is indicating barber pole worm.
Mm-hmm. It is. And 3 is that
Question mark.
question mark. Yeah.
I'm just saying that. So from your example there, 30, you should go back up.
Sure.
3,600 with a 3
Mm-hmm.
versus 4,900 with a 2.
Yes.
4,900 with a 2 looks like resilience to me.
Correct.
3,600 with a 3
Mm-hmm.
isn't resistant to me.
Mm-hmm.
150 with a 3
Mm-hmm.
is resistant, but I don't know what's going on with the FAMACHA score.
Mm-hmm.
150 is 150. That's 3 eggs.
So that animal just wasn't able to tolerate a high worm burden as
The
well.
other thing that can play is only because I've had this happen is.
Do you want to speak into the microphone,
sure.
Rachel? Thank you.
Sorry. So I have sheep that are an anomaly. I have Icelandics. There's a support group for us. But I actually have a copper. What's the opposite word? Deficiency. I have a copper deficiency, and we always tell you to don't feed too much copper. Don't feed too much copper. But I'm here to tell you, make sure you know your copper numbers because mine are. I've doubled my copper, and I had to feed copper. And we are now at 70 parts per million, and sheep are supposed to be between 100 and 500. 1,000 is a toxicity. So when going back to your point, if they're score is at a 3, but they have low egg numbers, you could be looking at anemia because of copper deficiency.
Exactly.
So I just wanted to throw
Yeah,
that in
that's
there.
great.
Also, when they're anemic from copper,
Something else.
they cannot handle, because I had a lamb die of this, they cannot handle the barber pole. So food for thought.
The other thing is that Vermont is a subjective measure, so it's
Yes.
not an objective measure. It's because I do this with another person beside me all the time.
Mhm.
It's like she calls it a 1, and I say 2, and then we're like look at each other, and then it's like, well, it's a low 1. Well, mine was a high 2, and then
Right.
we decide. So neighboring Vermont scores,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
three on 150 might have been a 2 if I was looking at it. Might,
That's
I
very
would say
fair.
It's all subjective, even when you do it. We're doing fecal egg counting tomorrow for those of you.
For those of you who want to learn how to do fecal egg counting or have a refresher and know what it's about, or possibly do it for your own flock or herd, we are going to be teaching the how-to tomorrow, the part 2. I would also say sometimes fecal egg counts, if you are not a lab assistant, can be subjective as well, and also depends on timing and all of these things. These are just tools to assist you to know what's going on with the sheep, right? Because we always say work with your veterinarian if you can find a good small ruminant veterinarian as well. So
Yes.
So the other thing I wanted to point out is that these are snapshots, right?
These are snapshots. Yes.
And, to a certain extent, counting fecal egg quantity is sort of like going to your hen house and seeing what's in the nesting boxes and trying to figure out how many chickens are there because of that.
Correct.
Right? So over time, you can get ideas, but I think any single snapshot in and of itself is not necessarily a decision-making tool.
Yes.
If this ewe that has 150 eggs per gram, test her 6 times and she always has, I guess it's 150.
Mhm.
If that's a sort of a constant with her, then there's something, then there's a signal there.
Right. Yeah.
This one test, that one pellet that we pulled out of her anus that day.
Right. So what I'm hearing is there's a lot of ways that these tests are not definitive answers. They are just trends, they're tools, but they need to be repeated over time to be, to give us the answers that we want to get. So to address the consistency that you shared with individuals doing FOMACHA scores differently, individuals doing fecal egg count scores differently, one person did all of these for the entire project. And we did it that way because we knew that there would be inconsistencies, because Jess and we FOMACHA score differently. And fecal egg count test, we haven't compared each other, but we probably look at things a little bit differently. So for this project, this is a snapshot, and to improve consistency, that's what we did. We also retested all these animals in the fall to get an idea of what their fecal egg counts look like in the fall as well, because again, we can't make decisions just based on this, and producers didn't make any decisions just based on this, other than starting the conversation of, do we deworm this individual because of the egg counts? So
Also, just the FOMACHA technically should be done during the high season every 2 weeks, is what they say.
Yes.
Because of the life cycle. So there is a consistency factor. It's just life happens on a farm, and you would basically need an employee to do, FOMACHA and fecal egg count like solely as their job. So
yeah. So every 2 weeks for the people online, every 2 weeks is what we recommend for repeating fecal egg counts and FOMACHAs if you want to see everything over the course of the season. If you don't have time for anything else, please just do your FOMACHAs every 2 weeks. And sometimes we can't make that schedule, and that's okay. We can only do what we can do. Okay. So this is our goat group. They are the only goats on the project. They were show seed stock boars from a variety of sources, including Georgia, North Carolina, I believe Pennsylvania, and New York State. Each farm had barn space for all the animals, kept it really dry, only had newly seeded pastures, unfortunately, so the rotations were short. The farmer had just moved to this particular farm and were establishing pastures. They had a policy where they kept their babies inside for a year and a half prior to letting them even see grass. And that had promoted resiliency of their system because they were able to keep those worm loads down, those animals, get them to survive to breeding, and then they would work on worm loads after that. We already identified resistance issues in them, bottle jaw, and again, the kid issue because they'd had problems in the past. Yeah.
Keeping the kids in the barn for a year and a half, while it definitely seemed to have helped with the deworming, did it have any other effects like on their stress or like mental stuff?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering.
Yeah, no. The question is did the goats tolerate being in the barn for the first year and a half? Yeah. So I can't speak on that from a goat perspective, but when I was there looking at the goats overall, they had more than enough space per animal. They were always cleaned out. They always had fresh food and water. They were always curious, nibbling on our pants, following us around. They were very well socialized. This family had a lot of kiddos that would go in and interact with them.
So they had enrichment.
They had enrichment. Yeah. And they were doing pretty good. So when we evaluated this herd, 4 animals, and they were the ones from Georgia, they were one breeding cluster that had been brought into the farm, had very high worm counts. They had issues with bottle jaw in the past. They had issues with losing weight and condition in the past. So they had gone through all sorts of treatments. We recalled the treatments for this particular group, and they'd been through everything. So we were like, okay, we're probably going to have some resistance here. And indeed we did. We started with Safeguard first because the ivermectin class is typically the class that we find resistance to first. It's been out the longest. It's the cheapest, most readily available. Every single animal was resistant. Then we went through and treated with Cydectin. Then 2 of 4 were resistant. And then we treated with Prohibit, and 2 of those remaining 4 were also 2 of the remaining 2 were also resistant. So unfortunately, this farmer had run out of tools in the toolbox, and we recommended combo dewormers, keeping those animals inside. And eventually what that producer did is she sold everybody and started again because she could not manage all of the things, and she wanted some change in her genetics to help promote some resilience. So she sold all but the 4 most problem animals, and unfortunately, those were the 4 animals that we tracked through the study. By the end of the study, 2 of them had passed away from worm loads. Yeah.
Getting a little bit confused here about genetic resistance. Like, if you're seeing genetic resistance in the worm population, shouldn't that be the same across all animals?
So yes and no. So the question is, if you're seeing genetic resistance in the worm population, should you see that across all animals? Yes, asterisk, because depending on when the animals were brought into the herd, that's gonna impact resistance. Depending on what worms those animals came with, if they're housed separately, that's gonna impact their individual resistance. If those animals were interacting with other animal groups, so like at some point, a couple of these goats were kept in the barn, the rest were allowed to graze with the rest of the herd, and then they were brought back together for this project. And so because of that, that's why we were seeing the different resistances and the different animals from the same group. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So this was not a great outcome for this farm.
Yeah.
So could you make an argument that keeping those babies inside didn't do anything after all? Or are they 2 separate issues?
They are 2 separate issues. Okay. Yeah. So the issues were the farmer had accidentally purchased in resistance that then caused a larger resistance issue on the farm. Okay. At this point, they're keeping the new herd that they got in, everybody stays in. And that is so that the pastures can take a break, the pastures can become clean again, and then they're going to manage those animals inside as well as they can. We're going to go back this spring and do some work with them to see what classes of dewormers work for them. And then they're basically going to start again. So, yeah.
And we have 2 different resistance things going on. So we're talking about animals that can resist worm loads, and we're talking about worms that can resist treatment. So
yes,
that's also just so that some of you are getting confused with resistance being passed around.
Yep.
So if we know we have resistance to these older drugs,
Mhm.
why is no one developing a new one, especially now that we understand they should be used more sparingly than in the past?
The only comment I'll make on that is that there's no money in it for
Okay.
the drug manufacturers to create new drugs.
For small ruminants.
For small ruminants.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is why New Zealand has other drugs that we do not get to play with. But there's some studies that are happening for other types of treatments. And I know Amy's gonna talk about Wormex too, and it's not a treatment, but there are other things that people find can help or not help, natural ways to, you know, boost immunity or help flush out workloads, right? But again, it's not if you have an animal on its deathbed or, you know, bottle jaw kind of thing, if you give it pumpkin seeds, it's not going to save it. Like, no. And I don't mean that, but that's just what happens. So we're constantly with these types of studies and these grants, because I know Jess is also a part of trying to be a part of a more national one. There are these other things that are going on, and like, what else can we do? What other tools can we use? Knowing that we only have these 3 classes, right? And I know that a lot of it, because she's out at the conference right now, the ASAI conference right now in Utah, Nevada, I can screw it up, that they're talking about going more on the genetic resilience and resistance for the animals themselves. Kind of like when we started breeding polled dairy animals so we wouldn't have to dehorn kind of thing. So we're at this kind of catch-22 right now.
Mhm.
Sorry.
I just want to pull our questions so that we can get through. I really would like to hear the full.
Sure. Okay. I do want to answer the one other hand that went up, and then we'll save questions till the end. Yeah.
Did any of the producers decide to use bioworma after studies existed?
We did discuss the use of bioworma, but no producers on our study went forward with it. Yeah. Okay. So to finish this presentation off real quick here, so October recheck. So we went through and we rechecked all these animals in October at the end of the grazing season. We did find that most of the parasites had encysted at that point, but what we did see were the outcomes of how the management impacted the general animal health and general loads of worms over the grazing season. Animals at this point were mostly moved off pasture. Worm loads were almost non-existent, but the problem animals from before had worm issues that persisted. Most animals had not been dewormed over the summer, in part because of better management. So that was encouraging. Body condition scores for everybody on the study on average came up by 1 to 2 points out of 5. So we went from an average body score of like high 2s to like low 4s. And we had no issues with coats. We had some DAGs, but that was isolated to good pasture nutrition and not correlated with fecal egg counts. But we still don't know stuff. We talked a lot. I love you all because you brought up all of these points about things that we can't say for sure out of this study. This is a snapshot study. This is to understand what resistance looks like in this part of the world with this group of producers. We didn't test all dewormers on all animals, so not even every single farmer on the project might not know exactly which of the 3 classes works. They just know the class that worked when we retested. So there's still some unknowns there. We also know the seasonal changes had impacted the encysting of the worms at the end of the season. What if we tested worm counts in July instead of October? What would that have looked like? And again, we couldn't pick out which exact worm species were the problem. So we couldn't say in a sample of 100 eggs per gram, 70 of those were barber pole and 30% were brown stomach worm. We did not have that capacity. So there's a lot of areas for future research that came out of this project. This is the Wormex site that Rachel referred us to. If you have not explored this site, I highly recommend it if you raise sheep or goats or are considering getting into it. There are resources on here. There are peer-reviewed papers on here. There are deworming recommendations in terms of the volume of dewormer to give to which species. So you don't necessarily need to tap a veterinarian every time you need to double check a dosage calculation. There's information on how to deal with deerworm and all of the things. So highly recommend doing this. The training events tab all the way to the right-hand side is where you're going to find trainers that are certified in FAMACHA if you want to go ahead and contact them to get them started in a training in your area. And it also lists all the upcoming FAMACHA events. So if you're, you know, close to one, you can go. You can input.
Okay.
Yes.
So originally Rachel White was supposed to be here from UMaine to talk about her deworm study. Unfortunately, she had a health event come up, but fortunately, Cornell Cooperative Extension as a whole across the state, we are having a webinar, a free webinar, February 25th at 6 p.m. And I did not print out anything on that, okay. But we can get the information to you. I could probably even post it on Hoover with the flyer for if you want to listen to a presentation on, it's her presentation on the deworm, and Dr. Mary Smith is going to be talking about liver flukes. So it's a free webinar, 6 p.m. February 25th. And so that, I just wanted to add that in there as well, because that was supposed to also be part of today. So
stay here.
Okay.
You talk a lot of good things. All right.
I just did this presentation last night, so.
So I found this little drawing by Tommy Siegel and it made me grin. So happy New Year, happy grazing season. I would strongly suggest this year is the year where you look over your parasite management plans and make some decisions and make some changes to better impact your production. If you have questions, there's folks like Rachel and I all over the place. Cooperative Extension is in every state, most counties across each state. So please reach out to us. We're here to help.
And I'm with the New England Grazing Network too. So I also know folks in the New England area that can assist you as well. So, which I was supposed to introduce you and I failed at my time management.
That's okay. This is Rachel Moody. I didn't introduce her. This is Rachel Moody, everybody. She works with the Capital Area Ag and Hort program on the eastern side of the state.
So I'm just outside of basically Albany in 4 counties, including Albany. So I'm right on the Vermont and Massachusetts border. And I grew up 20 minutes from the Mass border. That's where I live.
So there's my contact information there. If you have any questions specifically related to this presentation is recorded. It will be shared with all attendees following the completion of the conference this weekend. So,
all right.
And then there's our upcoming session. Questions?
Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to ask some questions about the life cycle of brown stomach worm.
Yeah.
I think it wasn't in this presentation. It's something that I think about a lot as a producer, but I work premium extension. So
yes.
Just like how to avoid it, because obviously if a humongous die-off is 45 to 60 days with normal conditions, what's the die-off for telangiectasia or whatever you want to call it?
Right. Yeah. So what's the die-off period for brown stomach worm? What's the management strategy? So we lump them together with homunculus. I don't have that pulled out unless you know that number.
Well, based off of what Jess and I were talking about last night, is they're lumped together because they have a very similar, that life stage is all really similar. The nuances happen to be where exactly they're affecting, what they're affecting on the animal. So that's why when we talk about the stomach worms and when your vets do a fecal egg count, they give it back to you as stomach worms, and why homunculus is pulled out just because of the sheer numbers, because they are extreme high reproducers versus the other ones that are much lower. So that's really, there might be like Jan Leota at Cornell, who's like a microbiologist. She might be able to tell you the exact, this one's, 40 days, this one's 42 days. It's kind of like saying, well, cows are 283 days for their gestation, but some are 280, some are 290. So so they kind of get lumped together because their life stage is essentially parallel. Yeah. So does that answer?
Yeah.
So basically what we have available for wormers right now is what we have in the pipeline.
That is correct. Yep.
Make some noise about it. So maybe that will change. Yeah.
I walked in late, so maybe, did you guys talk about NSIP, natural sheep?
We did not, but if you're willing to.
I was going to mention that as well.
Well,
yeah.
So an NSIP is a great place to look if you're trying to buy a new flock, some new genetics. the sheep have gone through this program where they're tracking everything, and you'll get much higher quality sheep resistance if you buy NSIP sheep.
It's a whole program that they are doing exactly these things
Yeah.
and doing these genetic traces. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
Because, it was-
Can I follow up on that? Just don't mean to interrupt you, but can I
Yeah.
follow up on that? I was for 6 years the NSIP representative for the Katahdin breed, with the US. And so I've done a lot of work with genetics for worm resistance in the Katahdin breed. And one thing that this gentleman's mentioning is that these sheep have statistics, much like a baseball player has statistics, a pitcher, a batter, a fielder. There's statistics on worm resistance, the genetic potential for worm resistance. And it's done through fecal egg counts, as was described here. The key to that is that all the animals tested are part of the same exact contemporary group, and they have the exact same exposure to worms on pasture. So they all have an equal opportunity to have the same exact worm load. Therefore, when you look at that tally across all the 100 lambs you measured, then the differences between them are genetic, as close as we can get. So it's an objective measure. So awesome for bringing that up.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I've been at it for a long time.
Yeah.
So you mentioned New Zealand has better drugs. If I know someone in New Zealand, like, could I just have them bring some drugs for me?
We cannot answer that question.
You see what is on our shirt? Did you tell me
That's like talking about raw milk to Cornell.
I
cannot comment.
Okay.
About that, there are drugs that, I know some people who have reported, but I did ask my vet about them, and some of them actually cause blindness if you splash them in your eye, and as you well know, when drenching sheep, you can get splashed active facilities. So there are some reasons why some of them aren't allowed in the US, for good reasons.
Yeah.
So I don't think you wanna make your sheep blind or yourself. There might be others that should be imported aren't, but just please be careful.
And the residue, the drug residue, we don't have an FDA approval of what that residue withhold is. So, yeah.
It's like off-label stuff.
So I've had goats for 20 years, but because we wander, and because I'm the leaf fodder, woody forage person.
Oh,
like,
I
we say our
wanted
grants
to
in a row,
talk
but
to
we're
her.
talking about that. Anyway, I don't much have root problems, but one time I had, and it came high worm count, and so they were like, no, we don't trust wormwood. So what are the limitations? Do you know the limitations of using wormwood? My goats just they want to devour it. Like I just threw 2 pounds to 7 goats, and they fought over it.
Yeah.
Yesterday.
I can't speak to wormwood specifically.
But anyway, so
no.
she doubted it, so I did wormwood, just dried herb.
Mm-hmm.
And so because she doubted it, I had another worm count, and it was 0. Which I guess I overdid it maybe.
So these are the things that we're talking about where there are hopefully going to be studies going into other means other than drugs that are on the shelf that we can use now.
Right. And
So that's, and I know there are certain groups like Sarah Nofa that would be able to, get those studies underway for, but that's why we're not saying it doesn't work per se, but like when I heard your talk and you said do not feed box elder, my sheep love box elder leaves. So I was like, oh.
Right. Just 2 other little things before I let go of you. So I was curious if anyone knows about like resilience as far as the worms to wormwood, and then I just wanted to say that traditionally when people were transitioning in like the mid 1700s from all leaves for sheep and no grass at all, like, and they were starting to have horse-drawn equipment and stuff later in the 1700s. But as things over a couple hundred years drifted from just feeding leaves in the winter to feeding grass hay in the winter, people with sheep were not feeding any grass hay to sheep specifically, and what they said was because that would get rid of the wormwood load over the winter if they did not feed grass hay and only fed woody forages to sheep. This was mostly dried sheaves of leaves.
Right.
But nobody's really done much with that, so I haven't got any cannon work. But
nobody's
doing wormwood. So if anyone wants to do that stuff, I have roots to get leaves.
Fantastic. Thank you.
But we're working on the, you know, like getting quantities enough for big herds is
Tricky.
Still, you know, there's mechanical things that Carl has.
Yeah. So let's.
Natural dewormers, tobacco is an incredibly effective dewormer. The problem is that the lethal dose for the parasites and the lethal dose for the sheep is very, very similar.
Yeah.
One could say that about Prohibit as well, which is why we have to weigh them.
So you're yeah.
Very quick, just another resource, people, Pipestone Sheep and Wool program. I went out and did that sheep school this past year. It's a 3-day intensive, and you will learn everything you didn't know about sheep plus more. It's an incredible program. And you'll go out and visit farms that have 2,000 sheep or 6,000 sheep, but you'll see a lot of this stuff. Pipestone Sheep and Wool program.
And there's one more. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I addressed this in the very beginning. Have you had any experience, or does anyone know anything about using biochar for?
So I don't have experience with biochar for parasites, and I haven't heard of research, peer-reviewed research yet on the topic, but I know it is a hot topic.
Yeah, Swiss. The Swiss journal that Mark Fulford was recommending that talks a lot about. It's real small doses.
We'll look into it.
Yeah, because I know that there's biochar.
The name of
There's a lot of biochar studies being done for other things and soil health and things like that. So it's very interesting. I'm trying to remember. There was a talk that was just given about biochar. I was trying to remember.
Yeah, it was soil based.
But that's another thing.
So what's our time?
We have more.
Okay, great. Yes.
Have more questions, maybe?
We'll do that.
On the subject of natural dewormers, I just wanted to mention, I used to work at a goat-dairy, and we would use black walnut leaves, and that's a great dewormer as well, and that's.
And black walnut tincture is another one that somebody told me about too, if you can get tincture.
Yeah.
And it has to do with what this one was talking about with the tannins. And again, I'm not.
You can buy it ground up too.
And I personally don't know if it's a if it's, you know, to help, you know, with the loads in the beginning. I don't know if it would be a treatment. So that's the things we have to look into too, is like, you know, what she's saying, she fed it and then all of a sudden there were 0 worms, but how high are the worm loads?
But that wasn't true. That was worm herb.
Okay, but so I'm just meaning, like, is it, the more studies need to be done on using dosages and will it actually treat the animals versus you're just kind of like what we do for vinegar in the water for chickens to try to keep some parasite loads down kind of thing. So that's just what we're.
And wild carrot seeds or any carrot seeds, so Queen Anne's lace or cultivated carrots is another one, and that one is.
So careful if they're pregnant.
Right. There's always the caution. Yes.
There's some also really cool research. I think it's at Scott Bozeman out of West Virginia, who's associated with some of the discovering that sheep that are resistant and they have good fecal egg counts when you do the fecal egg counts correctly, that they are actually healthier sheep. So they get less mastitis. They have better colostrum, and so there are dewormers that work or don't work. But I think, you know, really as the sheep industry should be really looking towards, you know, selecting for resistance instead of worrying about, you know, trying
overall
to
health as a sheep.
Yeah. And so like his work is pretty awesome, and there's some interesting stuff about how you know, selecting for resistance and calling all of those heavy carriers, even if they are resilient or whatever, that you know, they're not just typhoid bacteria in your flock. They also might get mastitis more, and they might get pneumonia, and so on lambs.
Yeah.
Also, just real quick, I wanted to mention the copper wire particles, and there's been some work done with that plus the trefoil. And there are some sheep folks that I know, and also I plan on using it with my flock because they're primitive, that you can give copper wire boluses also to help with parasite loads as well.
But again, that's not treatment, it's prophylactic. Yes.
On the topic of selecting for resistance,
have equipment, like that.
Yeah, handling equipment.
Challenge to getting and collecting validated.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about what you were using or.
Yeah. So what did we do to get the data collected? Okay, so I don't remember the exact number, but half had shoots and half had no shoots. What we did require is that the animals were put into an area where they could be contained. For some farms, this looked like running them in a pen in the barn, and then we would just like grab onto them. One person would grab them and the other person would do the analysis. Or we put up hog panels with like carabiner clips to make a makeshift pen, ran them into that, and then did the same procedure where we would catch each individual one. Is it dangerous? Yes. Is it sweat inducing? Absolutely. Would I recommend it? But it does get the job done. And if you're in New York State, and John May might be national. Is John May national? So at least in New York State, there's a grant called the John May Safety Grant, and they will refund up to 50% of an up to $10,000 project for you to improve safety on your farm, including chute systems.
But those of us who don't have the money or the numbers to make it feasible for chutes, using gates,
Yes.
making a small pen, especially with sheep that don't like to be separated. If you have a small group of sheep and you just put them tight in a pen together, it makes it much easier to grab them.
So we did that procedure where we ran them into a pen and we crunched them in together. We did that on the farm I was talking about where we had all the lamb mortality. We did I-scores on every single animal, and in 3 people, 200 sheep, took us about an hour and a half.
I can be really quick. I've had sheep since the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
Started with none. I've got a lot now. And we finally bought sheep handling equipment 10 years ago. Should have done it in 1980.
It's a young man's game, trying to catch up.
I think we're gonna have to time on this so that we can have a break before the next
Thank you
session.
so much.
Thank you so much.